New York's Korean Mafia king, seconds from signing a new wife contract, betraying the Black Queen who raised his daughters. Those little girls burst through the door, screaming, "We don't want a new mom!" Her revenge? Blood-chilling. The penthouse smelled like roses and lies. 50 floors above Manhattan, the city's most feared man stood at a marble altar in a room full of people paid to smile. 2 red laser beams sliced silently through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him, a reminder that no one in this room was truly safe, not even the man getting married. Junseo didn't flinch. He never did. 3 years of grief had carved the softness right out of him, leaving something colder, something untouchable. The scar running along his jaw was the only thing on him that wasn't tailored to perfection. He stood still, jaw locked, my eyes forward, exactly the way a dragon was supposed to look on the night he chose his queen. But the throne he was handing over still smelled like someone else. Kimberly. Her name lived somewhere behind his sternum, quiet and aching, the way a wound does when it never fully closes. She had been his, brilliant, bold, warm, in ways that embarrassed him. A black woman from Harlem who walked into a room full of Korean crime lords and made every single one of them feel like the outsider. She didn't shrink. She never shrunk. She matched Junseo's silence for silence, fire for fire, and somewhere in the middle of all that danger, he had loved her completely. Then she was gone. An explosion, a charred necklace pulled from the water, nothing else, and Junseo. He buried the softness she gave him right alongside her memory. Now he stood here, marrying a woman who felt like winter. Min-Hee, polished, political, perfect on paper. The Council of Elders had chosen well. She smiled at him like she already owned every room he'd ever walked into. And something about that smile sat wrong in his chest, though he couldn't name why. He should have listened to that feeling. Because the moment the priest cleared his throat and the ceremony began, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom exploded open, and 2 little girls, barely 5 years old, their faces soaked with tears and their voices raw from screaming, tore past the armed guards like they carried thunder in their tiny chests. "No! We don't want a new mom! We want our mom!" The room stopped breathing. Junseo's hand drifted, slowly, instinctively, to the holster beneath his jacket. He looked at his daughters, then at Min-Hee, and Min-Hee didn't even blink. That's when he knew. The most dangerous thing in that room was never the snipers on the rooftop. It was her smile. He kept her necklace in his left pocket, always the left, closest to the chest, closest to the thing that had stopped working the night the harbor swallowed her whole. Junseo reached for it now, a reflex, the way soldiers reach for their dog tags in enemy territory, his fingers closing around the charred gold chain as the ballroom chaos swirled around him. The twins were still screaming, his men were exchanging glances, and Min-Hee stood beside him, unbothered, like a woman who had already written the ending to every possible story in this room. He hated that about her. Kimberly had never been unbothered. That was the thing people misunderstood about her. They saw the grace, the measured voice, the way she could silence a room full of armed men with nothing but posture, and they mistook it for coldness. But Junseo knew what lived underneath it. He had been the only one allowed close enough to feel it. She burned, quietly, completely, like a fire that had learned to contain itself because the world wasn't ready for the full version. She was a black woman who walked into the most dangerous syndicate in New York City and demanded to be seen, not tolerated, not managed, seen. And the dragon, this man who had never knelt for anyone, had looked at her and felt something shift behind his ribs like a door he hadn't known was locked finally swinging open. He remembered the first night she stayed in his penthouse, not out of fear, not because he had demanded it, because she had looked at the storm rolling over the Hudson and said quietly, "I think I understand you better than you understand yourself, and that terrifies me more than anything in this building." He hadn't slept that night, not because of danger, because she was right. And then 3 years ago, the pier, the explosion, the necklace dragged up from black water, still warm from her skin. He had shut down every emotion that reminded him of her, buried it under concrete and command. It became the version of himself that required no softness, no vulnerability, no open doors. He had nearly convinced himself it was working. Then his daughters came screaming through those oak doors, and the locked thing behind his ribs cracked clean open. Min-Hee had a gift for making cruelty look like kindness. Junseo had watched her work the twins for weeks. She arrived at the estate with wrapped boxes and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile assembled in a mirror, practiced until it passed inspection. Hana had stared at the gifts without touching them. Sora had simply turned her back and walked away. 5 years old, and both of them already fluent in the language of instinct. Children always know. That was what Kimberly used to say. Min-Hee didn't understand that. She kept trying to purchase what could only be earned, softening her voice into something saccharine. Fa crouching down to the girl's level with a performance so polished it made the air taste like metal. Junseo watched from the doorway one afternoon as Hana looked up at Min-Hee and said without blinking, "You smell different than Mommy." Min-Hee's smile had flickered. Just once. Just for half a second. Junseo had filed that flicker away somewhere cold and precise. There was something else. The way she moved through his estate, not like a guest, not even like a bride. Like a woman conducting an inventory. Her eyes swept rooms the way surveyors sweep land. She asked questions that seemed casual, but landed with the weight of strategy. Where were the servers housed? Which corridor led to the private floors? Who managed security on the east wing after midnight? He had answered none of them directly. He was the dragon. He had not survived this long by answering questions that shouldn't have been asked. But what unsettled him, what kept him awake in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with dread, was the dance. The engagement gala, 3 days before the ceremony, when the syndicate's old guard filled his ballroom and Min-Hee took his hand on the floor. She moved against him like a woman who had already won. Her perfume was expensive and deliberate. Her fingers pressed his wrist the way a locksmith tests a mechanism, searching for the give. He didn't give. But standing there, Min-Hee's mouth curved at the corner, like she had found something anyway, like she had already been inside the lock long before he offered the door. Hana heard it first. It came through the ventilation shaft above their bedroom, thin as thread, soft as memory. A melody that didn't belong to this penthouse, to these marble floors, to the security cameras that blinked red every 40 seconds. It belonged to somewhere warmer, somewhere that smelled like shea butter and night-blooming jasmine, and a voice that had always known exactly how to find them in the dark. Sora was awake before the second bar. The twins didn't speak. They communicated in the way only two people who shared a heartbeat before they shared the world can. A look, a tilt of the head, a held breath that meant you hear it too. Sora pressed her small ear to the wall vent and closed her eyes. The melody floated up from somewhere deep beneath the building, fragile but certain. A lullaby about stars over Harlem. About a woman who counted constellations from a fire escape when she was small and decided the sky had been put there specifically for her. Only one woman alive knew that song. Hana was already on the floor, pressing a torn corner of her sketchbook paper through the vent slats, the fourth note in 3 days. "We hear you. We're coming. Do you stay?" Simple words in a child's handwriting, smudged at the edges from how hard she'd gripped the crayon. They had been building toward this for a week, playing lost in corridors, memorizing guard rotations the way their father had unknowingly taught them. Pay attention to what repeats, he used to say, because repetition is the only thing in this world that tells the truth. They had found the keypad behind the laundry access panel. They had found the single red hair pressed between the doorframe and the concrete, as deliberate as a signature. Their mother hadn't left them a cry for help. She had left them a trail. Because Kimberly knew her daughters, she knew they were not children who waited to be rescued. She had raised them in the shadow of a dragon and made certain they inherited the fire, not just the name. What Min-Hee had never calculated, what the council had never considered, was that the most dangerous people in this building weren't the men with guns. They were 2 little girls in braids who refused to believe their mother was gone. The gala was a beautiful lie. Crystal chandeliers threw gold across 400 of the city's most dangerous people, all of them dressed like they'd never held a weapon in their lives. The string quartet played something European and elegant. The champagne was the kind that demanded silence. And at the center of it all, Junseo moved through the room like a man made of controlled detonations, greeting allies with handshakes that meant one thing publicly and something entirely different underneath. He noticed Min-Hee speaking with Elder Park near the east balcony. He wasn't supposed to notice. The conversation was designed to look like pleasantries, two people making small talk above the city skyline. But Junseo had spent his entire life reading the architecture of pretense, and what he saw in Elder Park's posture wasn't warmth, it was transaction. The old man's mouth barely moved. Min-Hee's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that finalizes something that was never up for discussion. Junseo turned away before they caught him watching, but his jaw had gone tight in the way it did the moment before everything broke. Upstairs, beyond the reach of the string quartet and the clinking crystal, two small girls in their nightclothes were not asleep. They had memorized the shift change. They had counted the seconds between sweeps. And in the East Wing corridor, while every armed man in the building stood between their father and the wrong choice, Hana and Sora moved in the dark with the silent precision of children who understood in their bones that tonight was the only night that mattered. Sora pressed the note beneath the door one final time. 6 words. We found the code. Trust us. Tonight. Below the sub-basement floor, behind a panel of cold concrete and a keypad that had been quietly compromised over 72 hours by a woman with nothing but time, intelligence, and fury, a light on a screen blinked green. The dragon's wife had been waiting, and she was done waiting. The scream that came out of Sora was not a child's scream. It was something older, something that had been compressed for 3 years and finally found its exit, raw and absolute, cutting through 400 guests, through crystal and champagne and carefully constructed lies, like a blade through silk. The bad lady has mommy in a cage! The ballroom didn't erupt immediately. It did something worse. It went completely, suffocatingly silent. Junseo didn't move, not outwardly. But something behind his eyes shifted, the way the sky shifts in the seconds before a storm that will rearrange the landscape. He looked at his daughter. Sora's trembling finger was pointed directly at Min-Hee, her small face stripped of everything except truth. Hana stood beside her sister, chin up, jaw set, her dark eyes burning with the same furious certainty she had inherited from a woman this room believed was dead. He looked at Min-Hee. She was still holding her champagne flute, but she had not flinched, had not paled, had not done any of the things an innocent woman does when falsely accused in front of 400 witnesses. She simply looked at Junseo with those flat, calculating eyes and set her glass down on the nearest surface with a soft, final click. Then she snapped her fingers. The hidden men stepped from the walls like shadows peeling themselves free. 12 of them. Laser sights bloomed across the marble floor, crawling up toward the twins like slow, red fingers. The room found its chaos then. But Junseo was already perfectly still, the stillness of a man who has crossed from uncertainty into absolute clarity. 3 years of grief, 3 years of a charred necklace and an empty side of the bed and 2 little girls who cried in their sleep and thought he couldn't hear. 3 years of swallowing the suspicion that the explosion had been too clean, too convenient, too precisely timed to be anything but engineered. He had wanted to be wrong. And he hadn't been wrong. Min-Hee's voice came low and even, stripped of its social performance entirely. What was underneath was colder than anything she had worn at the engagement dinner. Kimberly survived the blast. She knew too much about the council's involvement. I kept her alive as leverage. Now finish the ceremony, or your daughters don't leave this room. The laser sight steadied on the twins' chests. Hana grabbed Sora's hand. Neither girl ran. They stood there, 5 years old. All braids slightly undone from the sprint through the corridor, faces wet with tears, and they did not look at the guns. They looked at their father, and Junseo looked back at them. The dragon, they called him, the man who had never once shown mercy to an enemy, the man who built an empire on the principle that emotion was a vulnerability to be surgically removed. He reached into his pocket, not for his gun, for his phone. He said one word, now. The penthouse died. Every light, the chandeliers, the wall sconces, the red laser sights, extinguished simultaneously, as though the building itself had exhaled and refused to breathe again. In the absolute dark, the only sound was the rustle of expensive fabric and the sharp intake of 400 people realizing at the same moment that they had no idea where the most dangerous man in the room was standing. Junseo was already moving. He had designed this building. He knew every corridor, every blind spot, every surface between him and his daughters by memory and by muscle. In the dark, he was not diminished. He was amplified. The scar on his jaw, the controlled precision in his hands, the cold economy of his body, all of it built for exactly this. For the moment when the performance ended, and only the truth remained. He reached the twins in 4 seconds. He pressed them to the floor behind an overturned table, his body a wall between them and the chaos, his voice in their ears, low, certain, or unwavering. "Stay. Do not move until I come back." Hana pressed her forehead to his hand. Sora nodded once, quick and fierce. He left them. What followed in that darkness was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Junseo moved through the room like something the building had exhaled, quiet, inevitable, absolute. Min-Hee's mercenaries were trained, expensive, prepared for most contingencies. They were not prepared for a man who had spent 3 years sharpening his grief into something weaponized. One by one, the red laser sights went dark. And then, from the far end of the ballroom, from the service corridor that connected the sub-basement to the main floor, the elevator doors opened. The emergency strobes kicked on. In the stuttering red light, Kimberly walked out. She wore the clothes she had been taken in, a red dress 3 years older, 3 years tighter across the shoulders where she had clearly spent her captivity doing something far more productive than waiting. Then her wild red hair, the same hair her daughters had inherited in shade and in spirit, caught the strobe light and burned. Her dark skin gleamed with the particular sheen of a woman who had made a decision and was finished deliberating. She was holding a tactical shotgun with the relaxed authority of someone who had spent months learning exactly what she would do the moment the door finally opened. Her eyes found Junseo across the devastated ballroom. He stopped moving. 3 years of grief crossed his face in the span of a single strobe flash, and then it was gone, replaced by something raw and less categorizable, something that looked like a man remembering who he was before the necklace, before the harbor, before the silence. She tilted her head, half a smile, the same expression she had worn the first night she told him she understood him better than he understood himself. "You're late," she said. She had planned this down to the second. That was the thing about Kimberly that the council had never fully calculated when they orchestrated her disappearance. They had assessed her as a liability, the soft thing that made the dragon soft. They had underestimated what a woman with exceptional intelligence, a laptop smuggled piece by piece through ventilation slots, and 3 years of compressed fury could construct inside a concrete cell. She had been inside their servers for 11 months. She knew every account, every alias, on every transaction that connected Elder Park to the fabricated explosion. She had built the case quietly, precisely, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most devastating thing you can do to powerful men is not destroy them in the dark. It is expose them in the light. The blackout was her trigger. She had written it herself. Now, she and Junseo moved back to back through the strobing chaos of the ballroom, and it was, in its terrible way, the most honest they had ever been with each other. No negotiation, no words, no space for anything except the absolute fluency of 2 people who had always known each other's rhythm. He moved right, she covered left. He advanced, she held the line. Her red hair swung as she pivoted, and her dark eyes were scanning, calculating, cold in the most beautiful way, the way a diamond is cold, hard, and refracting light in every direction at once. This was not the woman the council had tried to erase. This was what 3 years of silence and strategy looked like when it finally spoke. Min-Hee made her exit through the balcony doors. She was fast, heels abandoned, composure gone, the practiced mask finally cracked down the center. She had made it to the railing when she found herself stopped, not by a gun, not by a threat, by 2 people standing side by side who no longer needed either. Junseo looked at her the way he looked at things he was finished with, completely, finally, been without heat. Kimberly stood beside him, her breathing even, her chin level, her gaze carrying the particular weight of a woman who had memorized every detail of her enemy's face from a concrete room and was now seeing it for the last time in open air. "The council will hear about this," Min-Hee said, still performing, still reaching for leverage in a room that had none left. Junseo removed the phone from his pocket. On the screen, 3 years of financial crimes, 37 counts of conspiracy, and the complete structural blueprint of the elders' corruption uploaded simultaneously to every federal database in the country. "They already have," he said. He stepped aside. "Let the law walk through the balcony doors. Let the city take what the city was owed." And then Kimberly felt 2 small bodies slam into her from behind, Hana and Sora, arms locked around her waist, faces buried in the red fabric of her dress, crying the way children cry when the thing they stopped letting themselves hope for suddenly becomes real. She folded down to the floor with them, both arms pulling them in, her own tears falling without apology into their hair. The sun came up gold over the Hudson. It always did, the morning after things broke. Like the city couldn't help itself. Like it had to remind you that light returns regardless of what the night chose to do with itself. Junseo sat on the floor of the private house, not the penthouse, not the estate, but the small brownstone in a quiet neighborhood that no one in the syndicate had ever been given the address to. He had bought it 3 years ago, during the worst month, when keeping secrets from himself was the only way to keep moving. He had never let himself understand why. He understood now. Hana was asleep across Kimberly's lap. Sora had one hand fisted in her mother's hair, even in sleep, refusing to release the proof that she was real. Kimberly sat against the couch, her red curls loose, her dark skin warm in the early morning light that came through the undressed window. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. A stillness in her posture that spoke of things endured rather than described, but her jaw was still set the same way. And her hand, the one not tangled in Sora's grip, was drawing slow, absent circles on Hana's back, the way she always had. Like muscle memory was the one thing 3 years in a basement couldn't touch. Junseo crossed the room and sat beside her. He didn't speak, neither did she. He reached into his left pocket, always the left, and set the charred gold necklace in the space between them. The clasp was broken. The chain was stained with 3 years of carrying. It looked like something that had survived something it wasn't designed to survive. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, turned it over in her fingers. "You kept it," she said, not a question, a reckoning. "I kept it," he confirmed. His voice was quiet. The dragon was nowhere in it. She closed her hand around the necklace and leaned her head, slowly, without theater, without performance, against his shoulder. He exhaled. One long breath, 3 years exhaled. His hand found the back of her wrist and stayed there, an anchor, warm and deliberate. The city glittered beyond the window, indifferent and gold. On the table across the room, his phone screen lit up. He didn't move to check it, but the glow pulsed twice, then 3 times, insistent in the quiet. Kimberly's eyes tracked it without lifting her head. "You should look at it," she murmured. He didn't want to, but he had lived long enough to know that wanting and needing are 2 different coordinates. He reached over, unlocked the screen, unknown number, 3 words, the council remembers. He set the phone face down. Outside, the Hudson moved the way it always moved, unhurried, unconcerned, carrying everything the city released into it without judgment. The light shifted. Hana stirred, pressed deeper into Kimberly's lap. Sora's grip tightened in her sleep. Junseo looked at his family, this broken, surviving, extraordinary thing, and made a decision that had nothing to do with power or empire or the cold mathematics of the underworld. "Let them remember," he said softly. "We'll be ready." Kimberly lifted her head, found his eyes, and in the space between them, warm and complicated and absolutely alive, something unspoken passed that required no translation. The dragon was not dead. He had simply, finally, found something worth protecting more than his throne. Drop your city in the comments right now. I need to know where in the world this story found you tonight. Are you Team Kimberly or did you respect Min-Hee's chess game just a little? Be honest. Nee, if this story had you locked in from the first line, hit subscribe because part 2 is coming. And that message on the phone? The council doesn't send warnings twice. Like this, if Kimberly's comeback gave you chills, share it with somebody who needs a story that hits different. The Crimson Dragon saga is just getting started.